Wonderful. So welcome everybody to this presentation, this presentation that was meant to be done last year. And I'm actually happy that it is done now because Heather and I have been walking through this so many times, and it's just it's kind of like a fine wine, right? As time evolves, that it gets better and better. So very excited. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining us today for this presentation on the pyramid of intervention. And for those who know the pyramid, you'll notice that there's been some changes to the documentation. It is a little bit different. We've added pages and so forth, and that's why we decided to present on it to kind of show you the whole gamut. And you did receive by email, hopefully you got that email from me on Friday. I sent the attachments to the new version of the pyramid, one for elementary and one for high school, and we're still working on the one for K4, K5. So I will share my screen and I will let Heather start with the housekeeping. So give me 1 second. All right. And I will bring in this. Give me guys, oops, it's not what I meant to do. I have to do, wait, give me a second, guys. I just need to put it first in.
Well, I can do my introduction, Catherine, while you're
Yeah.
setting that, if that works.
Yes.
So I'm Scott. I'm the ALDI coordinator, and ALDI stands for Advancing Learning in Differentiation and Inclusion. I support the Spec Ed consultants and the Inclusive Ed consultants from across the province. I also support the remedial teachers. Those are the elementary resource teachers, and the supporting teachers, the high school resource teachers, or really anybody that surrounds the student with support needs. So I can work with principals or other. So just as we're getting set. So welcome if you're just joining.
Won't be long, guys.
We're up to 35, so a few people have just entered. You'll notice you probably don't have access. You don't have access to your mic and to your camera. So please use the chat. And just as Catherine's setting up, if you have any questions,
yes.
Check in with your sound. If you can hear us correctly, please just drop us a quick chat that you can hear us and that we're ready to go. That looks good, Catherine.
You know, when you have many windows at once, sometimes it prevents you from touching certain buttons. All right, let's do this.
Great. Welcome, Amanda. Okay, so just some housekeeping for today. This session runs from 1 to 2:30. Roughly around 2:30, we're going to allow you to ask the questions that you have that are a little bit more particular. If there's some items that you didn't understand, you can ask your question there. You're always welcome to use the chat to ask questions throughout. The 2:30 to 3 is optional. I'll repeat that at the end. If you have to whisk off, we understand. The slides will be sent to you following this when the recording is sent out. This session is recorded. It's in webinar format. Mic and video are not options for you. The pyramid of interventions may be handy to have in front of you if you've printed it out, or if you have a second screen, if you want to open it up. It's not an obligation though. If you don't have it, don't worry. We don't have a break scheduled. So if you have to walk away, no problem. Just come on back, and then the chat will be used for questions.
I am currently uploading, for those who may not have gotten my email, I'm currently uploading the pyramid of intervention for elementary and high school for all of you to have.
Okay.
And I think, no, actually, I didn't send it to all, my bad. I just put it to you and I, so I have to put it to everyone. Do it again. All right, we're getting there. So you will be getting into the chat right now the documentation that you need to follow for this presentation. And there's two versions. So one of them is elementary, the other one is secondary. Let me know, guys, if you've gotten the document there in the chat. They were translated. The older version of them were translated, and I've got a colleague of mine who's working on updating the translation. So just know that right now the updated version is in English only, but there is a previous version of it in French on the website currently. All right. And just know also that given that we're in webinar format and that we're recording, nobody can see you or hear you. So if you need to have a late lunch or whatever that is, you can just kick back and listen to this presentation. You are not on screen. It's just myself and Heather.
All right, so our goals for our time together, we're going through some FAQs, some frequently asked questions that come up, and really focused in on the question that developed this whole presentation is, how do we know when to move to the next tier of intervention? We're going to be introducing the pyramid of interventions and the applications and considerations document. This is the new part that's been added on. And always is to gain a better understanding of students and their behavior challenges. So those are our goals for you today.
Wonderful.
So in terms of our overview, very similar. We're going to look at the CEBM tools, Center of Excellence Behavior Management Tools. The first one is the application of the pyramid of intervention. Sorry, it should just be the pyramid of interventions, then the applications and considerations document. Then we'll move into the FAQs. Then we'll do an exploration of the Center of Excellence website. And we have a short survey, and then we move into our question period.
Perfect. So for those who just came in now and missed the first part, you don't have access to the handout just now. We will be sending the slides afterwards with the recording, but we did put into the chat the pyramid itself if you didn't get it by email from me on Friday. So it's been a long time project that and actually initially started with Martine Demers, for those of you who know Martine and that know Eva, who was in this role before me. The pyramid has been around for a little bit now. Martine initially is the one who launched it and made it more formal into a document. And then we had it initially just for the elementary level. Then we saw the benefit of building one for high school. And right now we're currently working on one for K4, K5. I've got the pleasure and to be able to have a few people collaborate with me to help me put together a version for K4, K5. And so that's the come. Please, keep an eye out for that. I put here underneath highlighted that the resources for K4, K5 and for high school, they're currently being developed. So you'll notice that on the CBM Resource Center, so not the main website, but the second one, that when you see tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and there's a bunch of resources and documents, those were designed for elementary. And so the CBM is planning on creating a similar version of that for high school and for K4, K5. And for high school as well, I've got some other people that are there helping me to build a bank of resources and materials and so forth. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for you guys to have a one-stop shop, that it's not just the pyramid, but to have alongside with that the supporting documents. And so I invite you to take a look. And right now, most of them are in English. I've got a colleague of mine who translates all of the documents that we build. And on the French version of the website, there isn't a resource center in French. What we're doing is that there's an extra section there on the French website called resource, and the materials are slowly but surely getting added to the website in French as well. So very exciting, a lot of different projects. But today what we're going to be focusing on is the pyramid itself, which is in threefold. You'll notice that there's a cover page, and that we won't be addressing so much today, the cover page in itself. It really is a walkthrough, and everything that's there is really simple and easy to make sense of. The two parts that we're going to look at today is the pyramid in itself and the way that it ties in with the considerations. So you'll notice there's a green, a blue, and a yellow. So green is designed for tier 1, blue is designed for tier 2, and yellow, orangey is designed for tier 3. So the page, the way that I've put it up in the document is they're done by tier. So you've got the cover page, then you've got the tier 1 with the consideration, then you've got the tier 2 with the consideration, and the tier 3 with consideration, and they all kind of work together tier by tier. So what we're going to do to kind of help not make it too dry, to be able to kind of walk this through with you in a fun way, we decided to kind of highlight it with a one or a combination of different case studies. So I will leave Heather start this part.
Okay, so ALDI works with an action plan. So I have an action plan, and part of my action plan is to support RTI, which includes academics, but it also includes behavior. So within my, as part of my mandate, I support behavior. So Catherine and I connected last year as we were discussing to present the first part of this workshop, which was collaboration for challenging behaviors. And we're following up now with our part 2 today. So I'm pleased to be collaborating with Catherine. Thank you for the invite once again. So in preparation for this workshop, I approached school principals in the fall, and I wanted to really test out how I could best support the school teams using the pyramid of interventions and also the applications and considerations document. So just modeling how we would work through this and you know, what's missing, what we used mainly. So we really wanted to answer the question, how do we know when to move to the next tier of intervention? So in other words, how do we know when to increase that support? So we can move to the next slide. So I did just that, and I went out into the schools, and I'm going to talk through a case study called Johnny. This is a pseudonym. This is not an image of Johnny. This is also a combination of multiple experiences in schools, and it really doesn't represent one school or one student. It's just to help us have a concrete example in mind as we work through these different phases. You're also welcome to just use your own student that I'm sure you have in mind to work through this scenario. So in my scenario, I'm working with only a few staff members from a school team, and we're collaborating to support Johnny. He's in grade 5. He has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD. He has the combination type, so hyperactivity and inattention. He's struggling with academics, he's struggling with behavior, and he also has a history of violence towards his peers. Once again, fictitious scenario, and he also has a bunch of strengths. So we can go into our tier 1, the next
Perfect.
slide.
I just wanted to add again, so
Go
Heather,
ahead.
you're using this example to walk it through, but people, please feel comfortable, you know, if you have your own example in your mind, and as you're walking, you know, we're walking this through with you, to have your own student in mind is just as fine as you know, using this case.
So the first thing that I noticed that I typically did with the school teams is that we did an inventory of the practices in the pyramid of intervention. So this is a screenshot of tier 1. Remember the green. And this is just what's in place at tier 1 for the student, but also for the whole class, because tier 1 is universal practices. So if we follow along with the orange arrows, those are going to be my symbols today. You'll notice on all my slides. These are used to identify what has been consistently implemented at tier 1. So the teachers in this school, this fictitious school, are greeting the students regularly at different points throughout the day. They're introducing and modeling expected classroom behaviors. The part that I noticed in working with different school teams is that often varies from classroom to classroom. And then in this case, there is some individual quiet time activities to support the students. So don't worry if you can't read the slides. The arrows are really the purposeful part today. So if we want to go to tier 2,
Perfect.
and then
And
we carry on with our, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add, you know, if you can't read the slides, well, the document that I uploaded into the chat, if you have that onto your computer, if you've printed it, you're able to follow closely with the document. I also wanted to reiterate for those that are not used to this document, that it's the first time that you're coming to listen to us and don't even know what the pyramid is, just wanted to reiterate that the green one, which is tier 1, is meant to be the universal best practices for all. And so although Johnny may be benefiting from these practices, typically at tier 1, school staff will be putting this in place for the whole group, not necessarily for any individual student.
Absolutely. Thanks for that clarification. So then when we move into our inventory of tier 2 practices, this small team that I'm working with has put assigned preferential seating in place for the student, and they've scheduled alternate classroom entrances for Johnny. He arrives 5 minutes after the class arrives. We can go to the next one. And so these ones, we haven't really addressed it, Catherine, so I'll specify that tier 2 become more targeted. So universal is the first level, and then targeted to meet small group needs typically. And so these are some of the things that are targeted for Johnny, or
Exactly.
they're scheduled in. And then at tier 3, we notice that there are quite a few interventions in place. So I'm just going to quickly go through them. So Johnny benefits from a one-to-one end-of-day recap. He benefits from personalized one-to-one movement breaks outside of the classroom. He also benefits from adapted schedule for the afternoon, which is also one-to-one. He benefits from one-to-one emotional interventions and one-to-one accompaniment during recess and lunch. So the visual of the arrows, I know you're doing exactly what the school team did, and you've come to the same conclusion, thinking that there's a lot of individual support that's provided, and that's exactly what the team noticed. So their effort for Johnny is really, right now, we can see the majority is at tier 3. It's heavy on manpower.
Mm.
So when you do this inventory as a team, it's just you taking a moment to stop and say, what's in place? Where is our effort being placed? Is it the right place for the student? It doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It just gives you a place to start from. So if we want to go to the next slide. So then some of the questions that we bounced around were, what if additional tier 1 strategies were in place for Johnny? So what if he received regular movement breaks with his peers? What if a key few tier 1 practices were agreed upon amongst the teachers and they were put in place across all subjects? Could this have any type of an impact at the higher levels? So these are just some reflection questions that we want to make sure that we get out, and this practice can really help that. This also, just on the previous slide, you don't have to go back, Catherine, but it becomes the beginning of our note-taking process. We're doing, we're analyzing what's in place, but if we timestamp it, then we have some data starting back from our beginning where we don't have to do additional data tracking. So one thing that's important to note, and there's some references in the reference list at the end, when we're thinking of our most difficult cases, and Johnny may be one of those most difficult cases, in my experience, sometimes we have a focus uniquely on behavior. And so some of the research that I've been reading, so one of them that's in the references is Roberts and colleagues, and he references how he explains how to do an intervention on reading and behavior. So if that's something that's interesting to you, you have the link there. You can go grab that research paper. And then this one, Barry Kukle also says that it's important to note for students with intensive needs, when learning and behavior challenges coexist, it's beneficial to address them simultaneously. So don't forget the academics, and there are ways to integrate the behavior into the academics, or the academics into the behavior system. Either or.
Wonderful. And so in this next question, kind of bringing it one step further into Heather's experience, looking at the pyramid in itself and kind of walking it through step by step, just to help you guys understand how do we use the actual document. And so typically, especially in the role that Heather and I are in now, we will be getting some requests sometimes from school boards where there's these very heavy cases, and many things have been tried out, and there's a bit of a discouragement that, oh my goodness, we've done everything that we can do for this student, and we're hitting a wall, and we don't know where to go from here. And so sometimes we'll be consulted to kind of make sense of what's going on there, but also, are there other things that the team hadn't thought about, and that we can help kind of bring that forward. And one of the things that we've come to realize is that by the time those cases come to us, they're oftentimes these very heavy, we call them these tier 3 cases, and that we feel like everything's been tried and not much is working. And this exercise of backtracking to start from the beginning is really an important one, because even if you have a heavy case with a lot of challenges, and that we've tried so many things, it is still important, even though you have tried things, not to minimize what has been tried, but at least to kind of slow down and to backtrack a little bit, and to cover our bases, and to make sure that everything's been thought through from tier to tier. tier. And so regardless of where the student is at, whether we're addressing a group or we're addressing a specific student, we will start from the beginning of considering if the student is struggling in class, what are, to the minimum, two universal practices that have been attempted, and how have those been applied, and so forth. So we'll walk through the pyramid of intervention. And again, my apologies for the text being very small. You've got the document there next to you. And so there are so many different strategies that are suggested in Tier 1, and these are the best practices that we have come to recognize, after years and years of teachers using these, that those are the top of the ones that seem to have the most impact. Now, it's possible that there's other tools and strategies that you guys are using that have great impact and that are not listed there. It's not meant to be an end-all be-all exhaustive list. It's a top list of strategies to inspire you. And it's possible, as you're looking at this list, that you're saying, Catherine, all of these or many of these are already in place in my group, and that's great. It's not a question of saying that you guys aren't doing enough. It's about reinforcing what is being done and that we look at how it's being applied. So in this particular example, I've highlighted two. So looking at, for example, structures and routines, looking at differentiated pedagogy, or looking at putting in place shorter work periods. You'll notice that some of these strategies that are in this list are more of the basics, the fundamentals, things that people, all people apply in classrooms for general classroom management. And then there's other ones that might be kind of like that little extra that we might do with a group, especially if we've got, a group that's very rambunctious, or we've got, very immature students, and we feel that the bottom line isn't enough, that additional things can be tried out. So let's start with these two just as an example. So looking at morning structures and routines, for example, in the morning arrival, what are we establishing when the students first come into class in the morning, as they're getting ready and prepared for the lesson, let's say, what does that morning arrival look like? Is that structured? Are there visuals with that? Is it the same structure, same routine every day, or is it a different one? What does that look like? Is there music, soft music as students are coming in? Is there a morning message? Is there maybe a sit down where we're talking in a circle with our students before we start the day, and so forth? And so the line itself, the strategy itself, can actually look quite different from class to class. We didn't want to make it too cookie cutter, and that it's a ready-made recipe. You need to make it your own. It needs to kind of feel that it is an extension of you, and it fits into your style. But so just to keep in mind these overarching strategies. The other one, in terms of differentiated pedagogy, we know this, especially in the English system, where we are more inclusive, thinking about what are these different tools and strategies, looking, for example, at the use of technology, where for some students it might be quite helpful, thinking about neurodiversity in terms of the way that the classroom is set up, in terms of is the content delivery really honoring all of the different types of students in the way that they learn, and so forth. And so these would just be two examples. Now, if we look at, if we're being sequential, the next step in terms of questions would be to look at the list of considerations. And so there are questions here on this document that just helps you walk through, if we're thinking about these two strategies and the application of them, and that we notice that they're not enough, that they're not working. And so before we decide to get rid of these strategies or to try new strategies, we're going to walk through these different questions to make sense of where we're at in the sequence of interventions. And remember that some of these questions don't apply. Like, if you were to come at it preventatively and you just want to support your group in general, some of these questions might not be applicable. But if you're coming at it backwards, where you've got a student in mind and you feel like they're a tier 3, but that they would benefit from tier 1 and tier 2, research has shown that tier 3 students benefit as well, if not more, from tier 1 and tier 2 strategies, not just from the tier 3. So if we're walking backwards in this scenario, we would be asking ourselves questions like, for the particular student we have in mind? Have we looked at, for example, if there's anything in the confidential file that might give us a cue on what's going on for that student? Maybe there's a code for that student. Maybe there's an evaluation. There's been recommendations that we haven't seen, and maybe that could help us to be able to double check and see if the best practices we have in place really are well suited for that particular student. Maybe there's nothing in the confidential file, but perhaps, if the student has been there for a couple years, maybe talking to colleagues who had the student previous years, and this is where data tracking is really important, to be able to have access to this information, looking at, are there things in the past that have been tried, instead of you trying any random thing. If you know that colleagues have tried things and it hasn't worked, or to the opposite, that they have tried things that are really successful, that gives you cues on different things you could be continuing that has been shown to be successful for that particular student. Or maybe you may find out about certain triggers for them and so forth. In terms of the two strategies that you decide to try out with the group, thinking about things like the frequency in which they're being applied, or the intensity in which they are being applied, the in terms of the duration of it, for how long are we using that strategy? Is it all day, every day? And remember, it's not applicable to all. Like if we're thinking, for example, of the morning arrival, obviously for that particular strategy, we're not going to be asking ourselves those types of questions about the when and the how long. But there are other strategies, like for example, the brain breaks, or the flexible seating, that question might be relevant. Thinking about, when are we using these strategies? Does it make sense to be using them sometimes or all the time? And for how long each time, and so forth. And so it makes sense then to be asking ourselves that question. Sometimes it's about the timing in which we use them, that the time in the day or the day of the week, that might have an impact and the benefit of that strategy. So the issue is not the strategy itself, but it's the timing in which we use it. Or it might be that we're thinking about flexible seating, but we've selected flexible seating that's not well adapted to that particular student. It actually becomes more of a distraction than it becomes a help. And so a lot of these different questions are just there to situate that strategy, and to walk it through, and to see, have I thought about that strategy from all angles? And so as we've walked that through, and that even, thinking even about, for example, having support of a colleague for a specific strategy, it might be helpful. Have we that's a big one. Thinking about that we've applied a strategy, but that we haven't taken enough time to really introduce it properly to that student, putting around, the rules and regulations, the boundaries, the structure, and so forth. And so if, let's say, those first two strategies, we've walked through all the questions, and that we've come to recognize that we really have applied it in every way, shape, or form, and when we're at the end of the road for those two strategies, then at that point, the suggestion is for you to add two more. And so I'm not saying that we should take away the structures and routine and take away the differentiated pedagogy, that we continue with those two, and that we add on two other ones, and then see if that's going to help with the group. Now, you'll notice that in the slide before, I had this green box here that said that it's important at tier one to value safe and strong attachments, between the student and the adults. And so sometimes, especially if we've got a very difficult group, and that we're focusing on all of the strategies, sometimes, keeping in mind, is the rapport there? And we may have a good relationship with our students in general, but Johnny may be having a hard time coming back from recess to connecting with you, because they were oriented towards their peers during recess. And so thinking about, now that they're back from recess, have we re-engaged the relationship? Are they attuned to us in that moment when we're applying the strategy? Or are we just applying it without there being the context of the relationship? And so this is so important. In general, we know this now with all of the research, that relationship, the sense of safety that a student has, is the bottom line that is needed in order for them to be successful in the application of other strategies. And so if we go to the additional two that I've utilized for this example, perhaps now we've come to realize that these two are not enough, and maybe we want to invest time and effort into putting in place brain breaks. Or maybe I was already doing brain breaks, but I wasn't doing them enough. I wasn't doing them often enough. And so maybe I had them once a month or once every 2 weeks or something like that. And now I'm willing to try using brain breaks maybe every other day to see how that's going to help with the group in general. In terms of a designated area, I know as I visited schools that not all classrooms have a designated area. Some classrooms don't have the space to have, within the classroom itself have the area. And so maybe we could think about, some of you have cubbies or closets that can have a corner that could be added to that section. Or maybe even in the hallway. I've seen amazing schools where they've got in the hallway designated areas that are set up there where the student can go to take a break. And so maybe you do have a designated area, but again, maybe students don't know how to use it or they don't understand the benefit of it and so forth to be able to walk it through. Sometimes I've come to observe that the area is there, but the tools and the area are not well adapted for specific students or for the group, and that those become now more of a distraction than a help. And so going back through the list of the questions, those questions about the not just the what, but how are we applying these different strategies and walking through all the list of those questions. And so once we've covered not one time, but twice now around the circle, the different strategies at tier one, maybe we're at the place now where we need to ask ourselves questions to the next level. So maybe, communicating with some of the parents or with the students themselves, trying to see with them where are they at? Are those strategies beneficial to them? Maybe they've got insight for you that certain of these strategies are more distracting, and we are not sure why, and maybe it's in the way that it's being applied and so forth. And so sometimes talking to the parents or talking to the student themselves can give us extra insight, or maybe sitting down with some of our colleagues and walking through some of the strategies that we already have, and to try to reflect on those and see maybe there's something we're missing. Maybe as we've collected some of the data, that all of a sudden, as we're noticing, from day to day or from, the time in the day, that there's other patterns that we hadn't picked up before. And so walking on through all of that first. But as we've walked through all of that and we come to the place where we've realized, Catherine, I really feel like we've walked through not two, but four, at least four, or maybe you've even tried 6 or 8 different universal strategies, and you feel for that tier 2 or that tier 3 student that this is not enough for them. Then now we're at the place as we're walking through, and I don't know if you guys noticed, there's these arrows and you've got the yes and the no. And so they're there to situate that if you haven't tried some of these questions, then go back and walk that through. But if you have tried and the student is responding well, then great, you can continue with what's going on, that what you've put in place. But if you've tried all of the different strategies, at least 4, and that it's not enough, and the student is still not responding and needs additional support, then you would be at the place technically that you would be moving to now tier 2 to more targeted support. And remember, this exercise is not a perfect exercise, and so it may happen that you're working with a specific group that you move over to tier 2, and then you realize that it's not needed, and it was just that you needed to change yet again more of the tier 1. Then it's really through trial and error that you're going to make sense of what is it that makes more sense for your group or for your particular student that you're working with. So if we move to tier 2, so again, it's a similar questions that we're walking through. So if the student has not responded to the sequencing of all of the interventions you've tried at tier 1, now let's try to attempt 2 different targeted practices at tier 2 and see if those work. And of course, if we've tried 2, by the way, and it works well, then you can continue with the current practices that you're doing and stay at that level. But if the student is not responding as you've tried 2, and in this particular example, the 2 that I've highlighted are, for example, systematic check-ins with a significant adult. And so please understand that check-ins is not necessarily done, but it's not the teacher greeting. It's not, in the morning when we are greeting our group. It is done systematically where we match make a student to a specific adult that has been assigned to them. And oftentimes that adult is not the teacher. It could be a support staff, it could be the school secretary, it could be so many different adults, making sure that it's an adult that the student is connected to that we've selected. And so one of the more popular suggestions that we have at tier 2 is the systematic check-in. I would actually recommend that if you are going to move from tier 1 to tier 2, that what at least one of your 2 or 4 strategies need to be the systematic check-in. Somewhere in there, the check-ins make a difference. And so that would be one of them that you would try out. Another one could be if you already have a designated area in the class, that rather than waiting for the student to get disorganized to use the corner, that now you're deciding to assign it, to schedule it for the student. And so we know that when Johnny comes back from recess, recess is a place, because it's unstructured, that completely dysregulates Johnny, and he comes into class already dysregulated. And so maybe the check-in might be the first stop where, the first stop where the student Johnny will talk to another adult, and that adult will check and see where's Johnny at in terms of their energy. Are they in a place where they are centered, or are they completely dysregulated? Are they ready to go to class now? And so that could be a way to do it. But obviously at tier 2, the adult cannot check with Johnny after every recess. We're still at tier 2, and so a check-in might be a first step, but it might be a good idea that we schedule for Johnny, that they have a scheduled time in the designated area. And so Johnny knows every day after the first recess that now they're going to the designated area first to be able to recenter themselves with tools before that they actually sit with the group to start the class. And so we are doing this targeted for this specific student. Go ahead, Heather. You have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, did you skip slide 21? I'm just wondering if it's
You know what? I
with
did.
my orange arrows.
I
Now,
did. My bad.
do you think I should go back
Please go
just
back.
to keep? Okay, so I'm so sorry about that. Let me just
No,
lower my hand. I was watching and I said maybe it's a different slide deck. I'm not sure what's going on.
I skipped a slide. Look at that.
It's fine. I just wasn't sure. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit where Catherine. So we're going to bring back Johnny as we close up each section. So I'll let Catherine go back to that tier 2 after this little blurb. So sorry to mess
No
up the
worries.
flow here. But what I realized working with the school teams, like Catherine said, is this is actually like a messy process. And that I noticed I hovered for school teams where they need support. So we don't actually go through all the steps, but in this case for Johnny and some of the school teams that I worked with, his behavior was still challenging. So by using the applications and considerations tool, we could identify next steps. It made the process pretty concrete, which was neat. So again, I have my orange arrows. And that first one up top is we looked at universal practices, and we knew we needed to increase the practices. So we incorporated regular movement breaks with his classmates. So if you remember Johnny's case study, he was getting his one-on-one, and we wanted to see, we decided to try, what if they were with his classmates? How could this have an impact? And then at tier 2, what if the teachers came together and the behavior expectations, those few core rules were the same throughout the classes that Johnny attended? What if we made that consistent? So how could that have an impact? So then we also wanted to see if we put these in place consistently over a few weeks, how might that impact those tier 3 interventions? Would they reduce? This was kind of our inquiry. When we moved down, we did go check the confidential file, and this led to more interventions at the tier level because we realized Johnny had listening comprehension issues. He had a weakness there. So this made us go back to tier 1 and say, well, what supports could be put in place? Visuals, brief instructions, step-by-step instructions, also with visuals whenever possible. So this was good for behavior, but it was also beneficial for all and for the academics. Nobody was really hindered by putting these practices in place. The next thing, the third arrow down was reaching out to other staff members. So it's really tough to put consistent classroom expectations across the classes that Johnny attends if we don't have buy-in from the staff, if we're not informing them of next steps if we're not collaborating and working together. And this is going to be a theme that comes throughout this collaboration and working together, especially for kids that, like Johnny, that hit that tier 2 and tier 3. We need the support of our teammates, our work team. And then something else, that fourth arrow over by the green box, is we also took some time to interview the different schools that I worked with. We checked in with the student, and in this case, Johnny had mentioned that he didn't have a place that he felt safe in the school, and he didn't have an adult that he was connecting with. And so this is a piece of information that needed to be recognized. Is this maybe a symptom? Is the behavior a symptom of a lack of attachment, and what can we do about it as a tier 1 practice? Just making sure that we zero in on that and give it some attention. So one thing that I had found is this, it's called a 2 times 10. So if you're like, well, geez, what would I do if somebody told me they didn't have an attachment? There's tons of things to do, but to really focus on Johnny, 2 minutes per day times 10 days in a row, allowing that child to speak about their interests. So you're gaining you're gaining more information about them. And then that allows you that back and forth over the next following days. It doesn't take a long time, but it's intentional. And the last piece was that the parents were informed, because often what we saw in the school teams is at the minute we add in something, it just might even be the novelty of it. The minute you shift things around, the student may respond positively. And this is a nice opportunity to communicate with the parents. We've put this in place. He's responding well, just wanted to let you know. And so to keep them in the loop. And then sometimes it makes our harder conversations a little bit smoother. So Catherine, you can go back. I'm sorry. So let's jump back into the blue now. So out of that tier 1 and into the tier, moving from tier 2 to tier 3 into the blue again. Go ahead.
You know, Heather, what I really appreciate about this, this section that you're presenting is, it really highlights well how, teams work hard and they're well intended, and there's so many different strategies. I mean, you see in this particular example for Johnny, there was so much happening at tier 3, and what I like about using the pyramid of intervention to kind of structure the reflection of the adults is it helps to slow things down. It helps to backtrack, to be able to verify things that we may not have thought of. And like, I like this example that you have here in tier 1, that we gave perhaps movement breaks or breaks to Johnny 1-to-1, but was it necessary at that time and place to do it 1-to-1? Maybe it would have been enough to do it with the group, but because we hadn't tried it with the group, we assumed that he needed to do it individually, and then it becomes a lot of manpower. And so how to be able to benefit from students getting a lot of support, but not necessarily always at tier 3. Sometimes when we're giving it to the whole class, so all of the other kids are benefiting from it as well, that now we don't have to duplicate the work, and it becomes that the same adult can give it to the whole group rather than it being 1-to-1. So I really do appreciate, that we're walking this through, and that we're using examples to highlight it, to help situate certain things, because sometimes, teams work so hard, and it's frustrating when you're paddling and you don't feel like you're making any movement. And so just to make things more consistent and systematic can sometimes make a huge difference. So if we go back to the tier 2, I was using the examples, and by the way, like it's a bit disjointed from Johnny's example because we're looking at other examples, but it's okay in the sense that any of these strategies, we're not fortune tellers. We don't know ahead of time which strategy might or might not work for Johnny, and so it's about trying. I mean, our intuition can be helpful. Speaking to the student or parent might help, but oftentimes it's through trial and error. And so trying different strategies, walking through that strategy and seeing, does it work? Does it not work? And sometimes it's a good fit, but you need to tweak it. And sometimes it really isn't a good fit at all. And it's completely, triggering to the student, and then you need to move on to something else. But I think it's interesting to be able to just give you more concrete of some of these different strategies, because I've come to recognize, getting feedback from different people who have tried out the pyramid of intervention. They'll say to me, like, Catherine, I understand what you're saying about the designated area, but I can't visualize it in the concrete in the day-to-day. And so how do I how do I apply it? And by the way, I'm going to show you later in the presentation the section on the website, on the resource center, where you have from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 the supporting documents. So each of these different strategies have a one pager or a video or a supporting document to help you take it one step further into understanding what we mean by that strategy and how do we apply it. So as we walk through the list of questions that are similar to the questions that we had in tier 1 about how often are we using this strategy, what's the timing in which we're using it, and so forth. If we're looking at a strategy, for example, the designated area, but now we're assigning it to the student, or we're scheduling it. Maybe it's the timing in which we scheduled it. Maybe it shouldn't be right after recess. Maybe it should be after lunch, or maybe it should be before, or or which not. And so looking at the details of that. In terms of the check-ins, I mentioned to you before that the check-ins are one of the more important tier 2 interventions that are strongly recommended to have as part of the ones that you're trying out. And so maybe it's the adult that is assigned to them. Maybe it's what is being discussed during the check-in. Maybe it's that the check-in's too short, or maybe the check-in is too the adult's not taking the time enough to connect with the student. Heather mentioned, and Johnny's example, that Johnny himself said that he didn't feel safe and didn't feel like he was connecting with the adults. And so we need to be careful. Sometimes we're very matter of fact, and it almost becomes, the check-in becomes kind of like a checklist where we're saying, like, are you focused? Do you have your material? You have your shoes on, or whatever it is, and then okay, go to class. And so no, let's take the time to slow things down, and it's a time for the student to connect to an adult. And so the 2 times 10 that Heather spoke about can be utilized by the teacher in the classroom, but it can also be utilized by the person who's assigned to the student during the check-in. And so forth. Maybe the issue for the particular student isn't necessarily in class. Maybe it's during recess. Maybe it's transitions that are really difficult for that student. Have we thought about what strategies or structures are in place for that student during recess and lunch? And maybe that would help for the student to not become completely dysregulated during class time, because it's those times that really kind of affect them, and so forth. And so as we're walking through all these different questions, and that we've tried another 2 strategies. So in this particular example, we've tried the check-ins, the designated area. Maybe now we want to try that there aren't just brain breaks in the group for tier 1, but that for tier 2, we're actually scheduling extra movement breaks for the student that are done in a station, either in the hallway. So there could even be, it's as simple as having a poster in the hallway right next to the class. So the student comes out of the class, it's in their schedule, so they know when they go, when to go. And remember that at tier 2, these are the students that can do this autonomously. They don't need an adult to supervise. So they know they need a break, they go to the poster, they do their movement they need to do, and then they come back to class when they're ready. And then we move on with the day. And so we try and see if this could be enough. You've got, sorry guys, I don't know why when I click on the slide it moves forward by mistake. When you've got mail is another one that maybe the student would benefit from a break, but not in the class. Maybe the designated area is not enough for them to be able to recenter themselves. Maybe they need extra recentering. And so the You've Got Mail could be a perfect strategy that the student is sent to an assigned adult. And it could be the same adult that is there to do the check-in, but it could be a different adult. And the student is sent with an envelope to do a specific activity. And the benefit might be that because they're doing it one-to-one with an adult outside the group, that might help them to recenter themselves much better than having the recentering in the designated area in the classroom. And so it's still a tier 2 intervention, because at tier 3 there needs to be much more supervision. But slowly but surely, as we're trying different things out, it might give you signs or cues about where we're heading for that particular student. Now, if I go back to the list of considerations, I skipped over the student challenge placemats. The student challenge placemats are additional supporting documents that, and there's 6 different ones. There's one for aggressive behavior, one for opposition and resistance, one for the student who is alarmed, excuse me, the one for a student who might be shut down, and so forth. There are 6 different placemats, and these are available on the tier 2. You've got the link here for the on the website. I'll walk you through just one to give you an example of what it looks like. So let's say Johnny is actually quite explosive, and that the behavior is, quite outwards type of aggression. Let's say that they are, kicking or hitting or whatnot. So we may look at, in the tier 1 to 2 in the classroom, additional strategies that are specific for Johnny in terms of addressing the aggression. So for example, when Johnny is dysregulated, and he starts now, upping, swearing, let's say, or he throws something on the floor or whatnot, keeping in mind the adult demeanor in the way that they are conveying the rules and regulation to the student. Are they taking things personal? Are they triggering the student further? Are they recognizing their role in the dynamic and trying to keep a step back to be able to not trigger the student further? In terms of maybe Johnny, is doing an activity and he's trying really hard, but he's not able to get to where he needs to go, and he's really frustrated. And so to be able to notice and recognize the effort, and that maybe Johnny would benefit from having the activities that are chunked into separate sections, because the harder, longer activities are just too much for him to handle. Or maybe Johnny would benefit from having a specific job that is assigned to him to be able to feel some success in the classroom. Let's say academics are really difficult. She mentioned, Heather, that Johnny has ADHD. And so perhaps because of the ADHD, it's really difficult for him to manage through some of the longer tasks that are really difficult. And so maybe for Johnny, trying to find other activities that he may like, and for him to find some success in the classroom setting. And so as we're walking through the application of not just a tier 2 different measures, but also trying the placemats, that we're at the place where we feel like we've walked it through, we've done everything that we can do, and now we're at a next set of questions. And so thinking about communication, further communication with that student, or perhaps with the parents, maybe something's going on at home that we don't know about, that's happening right now, that might explain why things have increased in terms of behavior. Um, has the student been formally referred through, and I've got different words there, by the way, because depending on your school and your board, you may have different terms to coin that process. In terms of the ad hoc, maybe the student would benefit from being observed, from there being an assessment perhaps, and so forth. And so maybe we need to start that process now for Johnny. Maybe we need to have the help of a board consultant and or professional to come into the classroom to observe the dynamic, and maybe having a second pair of eyes might help in order to see what's going on, and maybe they have ideas that we hadn't thought of. And so we've got a document called the intervention planning document, and also one called the action plan. So before I get to the second section, I'm just going to show you quickly. So on our website, we've got these planning documents, and these are not meant to be used by the teacher by themselves. This is meant to be used in support with a consultant and or a professional. And we walk through the different strategies that are being put in place, and there are additional questions there or reflection to walk it through. And so this becomes now the next step in terms of seeing where things are at for Johnny and what things have been tried out. Now, I mentioned a plan. Hopefully, since the beginning, you have been tracking the data of what you've tried, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and so forth. But you may want, instead of having just a journal where you're tracking what you're doing from date to date to date, maybe you want to formalize your notes in something that is more done in a different format. And so this document, which is again on the CBM website, kind of helps you formalize a plan for the student. It's not an IEP. And perhaps you could just move to the IEP, but I've got many school teams that will take their notes and that will formalize them in this way before they make the decision to move to the IEP. And so in this document, you may have questions like, what are the challenges for Johnny? When do we see any patterns? Are there certain triggers that all of the staff need to be aware of? What is plan A for Johnny if he's having a bad day? If plan A doesn't work, what is plan B? And who are the adults that are assigned to plan A and plan B and so forth. And so I invite you to go and take a look at that document more closely to help situate different things. But if we go back to the question, so as we have looked at the different strategies for tier 1, for tier 2, we've looked at now the intervention planning document with support, we've formalized the plan, we've given it a go, and we feel like after all of that it's not enough. Now, at that point, some of your schools and boards have additional support measures that are built in that other schools and boards don't have. So this may not apply to you. You may say, like, I don't have this at my school, this is not available, but I still want to name it here for those who do have it. And so there are certain boards that have a service called something like Project Harbor. Or Project Harbor is the name of a support at English Montreal. There are other boards that call it something else, but they have a specific resource, a specific service that comes down from student services or from complementary services, where we can request for a consultant to come to the school and work side by side with the teacher to really look at more closely the application of the plan for that specific student. And so at that point, if you do have that service, this would be the place to request for that additional support. If you don't have that and that you're at the place where you want to formalize the plan, you may be looking at that point for creating an IEP for that student. And before we get to the tier 3, I want to have Heather walk through her case with Johnny. And so let's do that now.
Okay, so again, following the orange arrows, we're in the blue section, and we're continually trying to answer the question, right? How do we know when we need to move up one tier of support? So in terms of the school team that I was working with, the school teams that I was working with, it's clear that the tier 1 interventions were not sufficient. Even though we've added, we've refined, Johnny's behavior remains challenging, and there's this piece that the school team's concerned about, and that's the aggression. So using the Center of Excellence Behavior Management, the challenge placemats that Catherine was talking about, we picked the one on aggression. And when we worked through the placemat, it was so reassuring, because as you're going through, there's a lot of practices that the school team realized, okay, we're doing that. That's already in place. But then we could find that little golden gem, that gem that was there that we hadn't put in place. And that was really incorporating a foster classroom. So I think Catherine's going to speak about it, but I'll just speak briefly. It's just having a partner when we notice that a student is getting frustrated in the classroom. In this case, in Johnny's case, it was towards peers. So prior to that, we would schedule in the foster classroom. This is not a punishment. This is just an alternate place to go work that has been set up, and that is the other teachers aware. And it's like, hey, come on in. Your desk is ready for you. And there's a little place in the classroom for that student to be welcomed in. So that's something that we added when we were going through the checklist. We said, oh yeah, we need to address this at the aggression. We need to try something at tier 2. So that came to support us and give us some resources there. Once again, communication with the students and the parents. It's super important to keep them in the loop of what is being put in place. So that needs to be regularly communicated, but also this keeping the journal in the blue box. Sorry, Catherine, it's so funny. I'm highlighting on my screen, but I know participants, I'm sorry, I know you don't see. So the blue box here, keeping this this journal or tracking. We keep coming back to it, but this is really handy, and this is what we can discuss with the student and the parents. These notes that we've been taking directly links to what we're informing the parents on. And so I wanted to address what Catherine was talking about, ad hoc, and then there's also another mechanism called the school level committee. Some people call it the school level special needs committee. So depending on your school board. So now I'm at my fourth arrow, where we're heading into some mechanisms that are already in place at your school that you can tap into. So the school level committee is composed of admin and teachers, and you can also invite support staff, which would be your spec ed tech and others. You can also invite your consultants, so professionals, speech language pathologists, they can be invited in to attend. And so really, this mechanism is to distribute services and to distribute resources, which would be human resources. So the SLSNC, or the SLC, I think some school boards might call it, is one support mechanism. Don't forget about it. So down at that bottom, that's something that we needed to put in place for Johnny and just come together as a team at that place. And then when we're considering the IEP, if we're getting upwards in our practices in tier 2 and we're encroaching, or some practices are in place at tier 3, this is really the point. It's messy. Again, it's not there's no black and white line there between a yes or no, but this is where our documentation comes in handy. And when we start to see that, these are necessary, and tier 3 are starting to become necessary practices for the student, and you're tracking and your interventions, this can all be brought to the ad hoc. Now, the ad hoc is signaled by the teacher or a member of the school team directly to the principal. And what results of the ad hoc is either further interventions. So again, this is a mechanism that's in place where you can invite professionals, and the result may come of it that you haven't thought of an intervention, and from this committee, the intervention is put in place. Or the other result is often assessments, or prior to the IEP, we will be looking at further assessments. So those are kind of 3 things that come out of an ad hoc. But don't forget that these exist, and this is a piece of support, and this is where we needed to go with Johnny's case also to formalize. I think I've gone around here.
Great.
So back to you, Catherine.
Wonderful. I was looking at the chat, and there's 2 questions that came up. I thank you, by the way, Heather, that you've been answering kind of as questions are coming up. Somebody asked about the You've Got Mail, the who makes the envelopes. So you will see that on the CEBM website, on the practices tier 1, you will see that further down, probably midway on the page, there are 4 samples of the You've Got Mail that you can print and use yourself, and you can make your own as well. But we tried as best as we could to have ready-made materials that you can use alongside some of these suggestions, and so those are there. Somebody asked a very important question, and I should have mentioned it earlier, so my apologies for that. Only might as well say it now than not. Somebody asked about a version for adult ed and vocational. Now, I do want to say that it's true that right now, as we're walking through this pyramid, the sample itself is an elementary version of it. But please know that there is a high school version of that. And, some of the processes might be a bit different from the high school to the adult ed and vocational. But that being said, behavior is behavior, emotions are emotions. And so we may need to tweak a little bit some of the perhaps of the layers of support measures that exist within your environment, but ultimately, addressing behavior looks the same no matter what age. And so for those that are here from adult ed or from vocational, I would suggest that we take the high school one. And similarly, right now, I'm working with a team to tweak the elementary one for K4, K5. I would say taking the high school one and tweaking it for adult and adult ed. but the core of it is the same. And you'll notice even from the elementary to the high school, although the setup is quite different, because students have many teachers in high school compared to elementary, where there's the core teacher and then the specialists. A lot of the strategies are more or less the same, adapted to the age, but a lot of the best practices, even brain breaks. Sometimes people will say to me, brain breaks are great for elementary, but like it's not stuff we do in high school. And there are articles that exist out there. I've got one from Editopia on brain breaks for high school students. And so I do firmly believe that although our students are older, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily more mature, and that they wouldn't benefit from these strategies that we so intuitively put in place in elementary. And I'm not saying it should be a photocopy elementary and high school, but I'm saying that there very much still needs to be certain key support measures in place at the high school that we think students are too old now, or that they wouldn't benefit, but they really would benefit. So I just wanted to reiterate that before we get back to the presentation. So going to the end of as we're questioning whether or not to move forward to tier 3. So as we've kind of walked through all of these different questions, and again, we're at the end where we've said all of this has been attempted and the student is still not responding. At that point, let's try now to up the ante and to move to tier 3. So in terms of tier 3, now we're looking at individualized practices. But remember, tier 3 should not be used in isolation. So it's not that we stop using tier 1 and tier 2 and that we move on to tier 3. We are adding. So we continue to do the tier 1. Some of the tier 2 we may switch over to a more individualized tier 3, but there's some of the tier 2 we might still continue to do alongside with the tier 3, and it depends on which of the strategies we've selected. So for example, in tier 3, in terms of the check-ins, so at tier 2, the check-ins are not necessarily done every day. Whereas in tier 3, now we're looking at having check-ins minimum every day. And sometimes they're even done multiple times a day because the student can't manage in transitions between classes without having that check-in. And people will say, well, I can't have an individual adult for every single student that needs a one-to-one check-in. How am I supposed to orchestrate that in my school? I don't have enough adults to be able to cover all of the tier 3 that I need to cover in the building. And so one of the support measures that CBM has proposed that is part of the pyramid of intervention for tier 2, but especially tier 3, is what we call the nurturing support center. So a nurturing support center is a space that a school has, and it's more than just an oasis room. It's more than just a reset room. It's a space that has been designed with intention, that everything has been thought through in terms of the setup of the space, the division of the space, the materials that are there, the adults get training, and all of this accompaniment comes through the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. So I will work with schools and boards in terms of setting up their spaces and in terms of PD and so forth. But I don't do it with individual schools separately. I bring in multiple schools within a board and work with them conjointly. And so it may happen that the adult that is running the nurturing support center could be that person that has multiple students with whom they are having a check-in with. And so it makes it more easy to have, that space set up for check-ins than to have, an assigned adult for these different kids and then not have enough adults to go around. And so it's similar to the tier 2 where we had an assigned adult, but now we're taking that strategy and bringing it one step further. And a thing that we hadn't talked about much until now, but it is there in every of the tiers, is in terms of emotional support and emotional intervention. And so looking at for the whole group where we're building emotional literacy to having more of these targeted smaller groups that are doing one step further in terms of support with emotions. And now at tier 3, we're doing one-to-one where we're supporting a student through the emotions. I would say besides the check-ins, emotional intervention is probably the second one that I would strongly recommend is present at all of the levels supporting students, because we know now with all of the research, with the neuroscience, that behavior is not in isolation. Students don't choose to misbehave. Oftentimes, when students are activated in their systems, situations have triggered them. And because of their defenses or their immaturity, they have a hard time managing themselves, and behavior then unfolds from that. And so, if we can help support students in building their emotional literacy, or help them, give them strategies on how can we find a way to recenter ourselves, or to be able to let out that frustration that we have in us, that there are places, pockets of time and spaces in the building where students can go in order to let out, or to grow and to learn on how to manage. And many of them, by the way, especially tier 3, they don't know how to manage by themselves. They need an adult to co-regulate with them, and to be able to do that together. I forgot to mention, where is it in my box? Here, I forgot to mention that next to my tier 2, I had a blue box that was similar to the one with attachment in my tier 1, where I talk about the importance of valuing emotional expression as key, in order for interventions to be successful. Oftentimes, when kids blow up, it's because they've got too much emotion in their system that has built up, and it needs an out. And so, if we can have pockets of time and space where students can express those emotions, they can let them out, then at least the glass will be less full, and they will be not as affected when things trigger them. And so, similarly to that box in tier 2, in tier 3, we have a box here where we're talking about the importance of co-regulation. Many of our students cannot self-regulate. They need an adult to do it alongside with them. And so, to go back to my second point, where I had personalized one-to-one emotional intervention, co-regulation is part of that process. And so, as we have walked through the first series of questions, and that we've attempted the first 2 strategies, now we might add, maybe the student needs to have an adapted schedule. Maybe, certain subject areas like French, for example, is true triggering, and maybe French, rather than doing it with the group, maybe French will happen now in the nurturing support center, or maybe that student would benefit from having an extra phys ed session to be able to move more, and so forth. And so, those would be additional supports that we would have in place. I won't talk about this one just yet, because Heather has a whole section on this, in terms of having a resource support, looking at through the IEP, what else are we putting in place to support that student? So, I'll leave that for now and let Heather talk about it after. But I did want to mention that at tier 3, we also have additional planning documents, additional questions for the team. Now it's no longer the teacher by themselves. Now it's no longer the teacher with the support staff. At tier 3, it really is a school team approach. All of the adults that are involved with Johnny need to be around the table to discuss Johnny, and to look at, have we covered all our bases? And so, these questions are there for you to take a look at. This document on the left-hand side is a document that my colleague Martine Demers had created to help accompany schools during transition times. And so, I invite you to go and take a look at that document, and see, during transitions, what else could be put in place for a student to be successful. Heather?
Yes. All right. So back to Johnny and his case. So we've increased those preventative supports at tier 1. We've increased the targeted supports at tier 2. And now we realize we still need to continue moving up into those tier 3 supports. And how have some of those tier 1 and 2 supports impacted tier 3? So this was our original inquiry we were working on. So when I look at the first arrow, where we're going to be focusing on as a school team, are the personalized supports meeting Johnny's specific needs, is a question that we need to ask ourselves. Because remember, these are heavy on manpower, and are they meeting a specific need for him? So this this question, this reflective prompt came out of one of Catherine's roundtable discussions. So I don't want to take credit for it. I just love this prompt. I noted it down. So when we're at this level or at any level, how is the support that we're providing working towards developing a specific skill for Johnny? So we really want to make sure that everything we're doing is helping him along in his emotional co-regulation or whatever our targets are for this student. So if we look at just a quick example, and we go back to our inventory of what we had put in place for Johnny. He is receiving this one-to-one emotional support, these interventions to help him express his emotions and to provide outlets for release. So in Johnny's case, he is using a ballon poire. So I think we call it a punching ball. I had only the French term. You have an image in your head. It's that one that you go back, goes up across the ring. And this is super this is effective for Johnny and is a preventative mechanism to allow him to release. So when we look at that question, there's a need, is the prevention that's in place matching up to the need? In this case, it is, and we're going to keep it. So this is a practice that we need to continue so that he can co-regulate. If we look at the third arrow, remember in tier 2 we were putting in those that foster classroom. So we want to inquire, how is it working, how's it going, are the scheduled times for the foster classroom at the right time, are they preventing those bursts of frustration? Do we need to shift the timing a little bit? What are some things that we can do before we stop that process at all? Or is it just working perfectly the way we have it? So it's just to inquire about what's in place and how it's meeting a need. You can move on to the next. So again, it's messy when you're working with a school team. We didn't go through, you can tell by my arrows, we didn't go through everything, but we really focused in on what was necessary. But my first takeaway is, thank you, Catherine. I was grateful to be kind of pushed into the schools to practice and to learn with them, and then to be able to bring back and share my experience here. We talked a lot about that team approach. So that is something that's so important. Get your colleagues on board. And one of our FAQs is, what if they're not on board? What is it we can do? We will be addressing that. So if you're like, yeah, but I have team members that aren't, we're going to address that later. In terms of consultants, start obviously with those that we know this practice, start with those that are willing to work with you. Remember, I was starting with a small school team, but slowly it grew as we involved others. And so that is key, and make sure your admin is on board. That's another piece that is key that we're going to be talking about. We'll highlight a little bit later. Problem solving with detailed documentation. So you really need, like we were saying, if you print out the pyramid and highlight and date, there's one form of documentation, highlight in a different color with a new date. These are tracking records. And then Catherine's provided you with some alternatives often also. But then when you arrive at some meetings, we'll be talking about it in our FAQs, you'll see that you're well prepared. You have everything you need, and it doesn't take you an evening to get everything in order. Prevention's the name of the game. So how to teach the strategies, especially those universal strategies and those targeted ones, well, all of them, how to teach them when the student is regulated. How do we implement them so that the student knows to use them effectively when they're in a difficult place, but we teach them when they're in a good place so that they know that they have access to those strategies. Ongoing communication, I am not going to say anymore, but being intentional. So I think what the applications and considerations helps us determine is, are we being intentional with the practices that we're putting in place? And the last thing is just, I learned so much, but I also had to go back to Catherine with some of the research that I was reading that wasn't aligned with neurodiversity or developmental approach. And I got confused. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you're a teacher, reach out to your behavior consultants or the consultants that are supporting you. If you're a consultant, reach out to Catherine, who has that wealth of knowledge. Reach out to the people in your surroundings when there's some research or some practices and you're like, I'm not sure about this. I had to do it. And I was grateful that Catherine was there for me. So let's plow on through we've done a lot of the parts of the
Yeah.
FAQ already. So
Yeah, I'm realizing this. So some of it once you get the handout, you'll be able to read through and it will make full sense. But some of the frequent questions that we get, and so one of the questions that I get is are these interventions that we suggest that are they based in research? And so these practices have been utilized, by countless teachers over, so many years, and so these are tried and true, I guess, best practices. Please keep in mind that these are supported in terms of the overarching lenses that are supporting some of these strategies. So whether we're talking about neuroscience or developmental approach or trauma or attachment friendly practices, neurodiversity and play, all of that is kind of thought through in terms of these best practices. So I just named a list here for those that are curious, in terms of different authors that are out there, for each of these different types of lens that are the foundation of the pyramid of intervention. Another question that I often get is, so what is the fundamental, like if we look at the pillars, what are the fundamental elements of the pyramid of intervention? Heather named a few of them, so I won't, be going into too much detail. But prevention for me, the two, if I were to look at all of them, the most important is prevention, and the teamwork. And so prevention, because oftentimes, especially with behavior, we wait for the student to get disorganized before we send them to do what it is that they need to do, the supporting piece. And the thing is that when they're dysregulated, they're not receptive to be able to benefit from that support measure. So that's why it's so important to be able to schedule, that we do this ahead of time, that we don't wait for them to be disorganized to do it, because not only are they reactive, but we too are not in a best place when the kids are completely disorganized. It affects us as well. So we're not at our best either when we are in that dynamic. So prevention, prevention, prevention. In terms of teamwork, the beauty about the pyramid is that it's not meant to be one adult's responsibility. And so we go from best practices in the classroom for all to now having support staff that is there to collaborate, to have at tier 3 having other players involved, resource teacher, the administrator, the board consultants and professionals and so forth. You're meant to share the weight of these students. You're not meant to go at it alone. And oftentimes we have this understanding that a student is successful if he or she is in the classroom and functioning in the classroom. I would like to state that a student can be successful at school without being in the classroom at all cost. And that's the important piece about having other alternative spaces in the building, like a nurturing support center, like an emotions room, where students can go and have respite, but to be able to have alternative settings where they can be successful and to be able to gain some strategies and to be able to recenter themselves, so then they can be available to be ready and functional in the classroom. But if all we think about is classroom or home, we're missing the whole in between that could be possible for that student. And of course, having the adults that are aligned, having a common vision, communication, all of that is important. And all the other things that I'm going to name that are part of the pillar of the pyramid of intervention comes alongside with the training that CBM offers. We have on our website, and you may have attended already to this presentation on the developmental approach. I did a four-section presentation at the beginning of the school year on the developmental approach, and I walk through, the importance of understanding maturation, understanding the defenses, understanding emotions, understanding attachment. If we don't have an understanding of the different elements that are underneath the iceberg, then all we see is the behavior, and then we address it at the symptom level. And so the key here is to understand the root and to address it at the root. And so we're always keeping in mind the student and what's at the root of their behavior, but also keeping in mind the context. So maybe the timing is not right, and so it's not the time now to be addressing the situation. And also keeping in mind ourselves, the adults. Are we in a good place right now to address the situation, or do we need another adult to step in to be able to support us because we're not in the best place right now to address it? And this is important. We're human, and we all have emotions, and we all get triggered. And so it's not about being perfect. We're not machines. It's about working as a team so we can support each other and so forth, and to empower each other. Understanding that behavior can only change when all of these things are happening and are in place. Maturation number one. If you have an immature student that is stuck, then or if you're working with a preschooler, there's certain behaviors that we can't expect because they're just not there yet. And so to be able to adjust our expectations vis-a-vis where they're at in their development, in terms of their defenses, are they feeling their emotions? Is the relationship there? And in terms of sensory and stress response, thinking about our neurodiverse population, are they receptive in the moment, or are they dysregulated because of the context? So if they're dysregulated, they cannot in that moment be their best selves. And so rather than trying to change the behavior or control the behavior, it's focusing on managing the circumstances for them to be able to keep themselves out of trouble and to be able to be more successful because the environment is supporting them. We know when it comes to plants, we're more intuitive when it comes to gardening, that when a flower doesn't bloom, we're not tugging and pulling at the flower to make it grow faster. We understand about fulfilling the environment. So it's the same thing with a child, and even a big child. When we're thinking about adolescents, or we're thinking about our young adults in adult ed, regardless of the age, a person will grow older but won't necessarily grow up. And so to be able to have the right elements in place. In terms of the type of lens or discipline or approach that we're using, sometimes we don't realize it, but some of our approaches actually will hinder the plan that we have in place. And so being careful, especially with our tier 2, tier 3 students that are very defended and have a hard time with some of these more conventional approaches, that these actually may be more triggering and exacerbate the situation further than actually help the situation. And so to keep that in mind. Heather mentioned this question before. So what if I want to apply the pyramid of intervention, but my colleagues are not on board with it or don't even know about it? So I'm kind of doing this by myself. And so considering that ideally, especially for tier 2, tier 3, where there is collaboration of other adults, you want to have a minimum of adults that are on board and involved for the pyramid of intervention to be successful. But please keep in mind that nobody else but you at tier 1 need to be involved for best practices in your classroom. So at the minimum, you could be doing the universal best practices for your group, and then slowly but surely trying to inspire your colleagues to come on board with this. And of course, it helps when you've got an administrator that is present and strong and has a good leadership. It really helps to be able to bring this process along. Heather, I don't know if you wanted to speak to this point here in terms of the agreement.
It's just that as part of our competencies, as part of our of being a teacher, there are some references that it's not going to be a coercive argument that's going to automatically make teamwork happen, but teamwork is part of our workload. So for somebody to say, no, I don't have to work in a team, I can work in isolation, where there's a few arguments kind of against that, but that's not going to help. It's better to bring a person alongside.
Perfect. Thank you. In terms of when should I be using the pyramid? And I did kind of refer to that a little bit earlier on, but just to reiterate, it could be that you're at the beginning of the school year and you want to be preventative with your group, and that you're focusing on universal best practices, and you would refer to the document then. But it could be that you've got a student, let's say you're further in the year, right now we're in January, and that you're struggling with a student. It's been a while now that you're struggling. You've tried different things and it's not working, and you're running out of ideas. And so that could be a good timing where you could refer to the pyramid of intervention. And again, even if you are at tier 2 and 3, I would suggest that you backtrack and make sure that you start from the beginning, and just make sure you've covered all your bases before you go back to wherever you think that you're at, whether it's tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. Again, in case I didn't mention this, the pyramid of intervention, I mean, its design it hasn't necessarily thought through of all of the scenarios. And so it's not meant to be a one size fits all prescriptive application. You really need to use this as a reflection piece, and some of it will apply and some of it will not. And so it's for you and with your team to be able to walk through and see what is relevant and what isn't. In terms of our next question, Heather.
Yes, I just want to be mindful of time. So it's 2:28 on my clock. I maybe have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to try and just pinpoint the items that we did not discuss, because you'll get the slide deck. But if you were really planning on leaving at 2:30 because you have something, if you're disappearing, that's okay. You can watch the end of the recording. If not, you can expect about 10 more minutes before we go to questions. Is that fair, Catherine?
Yes, perfect.
That's okay. Okay. Oh, good. So if we go to the next slide,
Yep.
we've talked a lot about this. How do we know which practices are suitable when? So really, if we look at that first bullet, introducing modeling and providing explicit teaching, so we call that explicit instruction in the academics. And then also practicing the second bullet. Oh no, Catherine, we're on the wrong slide.
I am.
How do we know which practices are suitable when? We should be on slide.
My bad.
Sorry, I was
Here. There we
this
go.
one. Thank you. I'm like, my notes aren't lining up. Sorry about that. So really, again, right, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So the first bullet is really addressing that not all classes and groups are the same. So you're going to have to do a problem-solving approach to determine what works, using that inventory that I talked about at the beginning of my case study, you know, just marking down what is happening, what is in place, I mean. And then if we look at the second bullet, some strategies may be necessary for some, but good for all. So we talked about visuals, clear classroom expectations. There's a list of them that are not going to hinder the education of others if we put them in place, but really they are essential for some. Now, I can hear probably the chatter in your mind, like, I don't know how to do all this. And so I picked up something along the way, and Catherine reminded me of it. So back in the day, a few years ago, there was a group of us following the inclusive and competency-based IEP modules from Shelley Moore. And so when we look at the third bullet, if you're feeling overwhelmed, like I can't do this, I have so many different cases and they have different needs. What she said, and I really, really loved it, and it's a mind shift, is that we can't support all students' needs at once, but over time we can provide support for all. So let me just hover on this idea a little bit. We can't support every student every day, every period, but what we can do is by working systematically and planning in our interventions and considering the needs of the students in front of us, by the end of the week, we'll get to specific support for all of the students. By the end of every second day, we'll get to support for all students. So to reduce that feeling of being overwhelmed, plan it out, systematically plan it out, and actually some interventions will be good for all, and you'll be double dipping. But also be kind to yourself, because these is a huge job, and we know there's lots of needs in the classrooms. So we don't want to come off kind of saying everybody has to have their needs met. Everybody will have their needs met eventually if you work systematically and you plan them in. The last bullet we went over.
Sorry.
We're good. No, that's
We're
good.
good. I could. Okay.
Yeah. So when a support measure doesn't work, how do we know when it's time to tweak it? So I wanted to go through a little bit of theory on the next slide. So that first bullet is really what we call in academics the explicit instruction, being explicit about what we want to deliver. The second bullet is really about our gradual release of responsibility. And so that's really guiding those students. And my next slide is going to walk us through a brief example. But these are if you just go back for a minute, but I'm not going to read through the next bullets, but these are just really what we've been talking about the whole time throughout. So this you can read on your own. The element that we discuss a little bit less is make sure to check in with the student before we trash something, before we're like, this isn't working. That last bullet of talking with the student, they might be able to give us some insight as to why it's not working. So if we go to the next slide, this is really on how to tweak. So I was thinking, I had in mind those classroom expectations and the gradual release of responsibility. So my first reflective question that I would use with a school team, or that I would use with self, would be, did you decide the importance of the expectation with the class? So if I was setting, it's September, it's January, I'm setting up classroom rules and expectations. Do the kids know why it's important? Do they agree to the importance? Would be number one. Number two, did you introduce, if you have 5 of those expectations that you want to get out, did you introduce them one expectation at a time and
Mm,
really add a layer the next day reviewing that first expectation? Number 3, was the expectation or behavior explicitly modeled? You can use role play if it's appropriate, but did you show them what it looks like? Number 4, were the expectations modeled and reviewed over 3 to 5 sessions? So if we pick 5 main rules, we introduce them on Monday. By Friday, we're reviewing, but we're introducing that last rule. So it's taken us a week to go through our expectations. Number 5, that non-desired behavior, what the behavior does not look like. Did we model? Did we correct? Did we make the desired behavior explicit? And did we make the non-desired behavior explicit?
mm.
Are the rules posted in a visible location? Do they include visual supports? And do you refer to them regularly? Are they alive? So if my answer is no to somewhere along this, then I might want to just try that one item and then see if it helps. So you have to, the guideline here is how to tweak, break down what you're expecting, and see if you've gone through all the steps and taken the time to explicitly teach it, and use a gradual release of responsibility where by the end they're doing it independently. That's all I wanted to say about that. Carry on.
All right. Still you.
Um, yeah. I don't, let me just hover here for a second. When to move, we've already discussed this. So
Yeah, we
let's
did.
slide.
Data
So
tracking.
how important is data tracking? It's going to lead to the IEP process. We know it's important. So skip this. You can check these guidelines later. So when is it time to call in a professional? I just want to check if I have different notes here. I think we've covered this through the ad hoc. You can call them in, but also through an ad hoc, you can invite them in. Through the school level committee, you can invite them in. It's really when you're getting to that tier 2, encroaching on 3, looking at an IEP, those would be my guidelines to say, I'd like to call somebody else in, a fresh set of eyes with maybe some different ideas. It's all written there anyway, so you can carry on.
The IEP
I love
process.
this question. So this might be a biggie, but I do want to stick here for a little bit, because I actually, when I was rehearsing for this, I flipped the question. So where does the IEP fit into the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management pyramid, or where does the pyramid fit into the IEP process? I actually was doing both. So we really, when we're at that tier 2 and we've double checked all our checks and balances in universal practices and targeted, and we're, like we said, we're encroaching on tier 3, we need to possibly move to that individualized education plan. And this is a tricky question, but I want to help you have some tools. So what is an IEP? What I highlighted was really what I felt we were talking about this whole session. They're tools that gear educational services towards behavioral needs. They can be implemented for a student experiencing behavioral concerns, adopted when typical strategies are not working.
Mm,
They are a collaborative process. They're based on assessment of abilities and needs. We talked a lot about the needs, but really we want to be discussing with our students their abilities and where they shine and how we can use
right.
the ability to support the needs. An IEP is designed to propose targets and goals. That's what we're doing. This whole process was about, well, what do we want for the student? What is helping him acquire these skills? And then there's strategies for support. So I saw so many links, and I thought it was important to bring up this IEP. I'm on a bit of a tangent here, and I apologize for that when time is short, but I only have 1 or 2 slides left. And so this one, if we look at the top portion, the IEP, this is all the ad hoc process. But where I wanted to hover a little bit was that consulting and needs assessment. It's exactly what we've been talking about. So summarize the situation. You have your data. Gather from all the people involved. Check back with last year's teacher. Review the assessments that have not yet come in. If you have non-teaching professionals accessible to your students, and that's the next step, then we need to signal it at this consulting and needs assessment phase. I think you can read it, and then it's really, once we have all the data out and the team is here, then the principal really makes that final decision. But as a team approach, we decide, yeah, this student needs to move onto an IEP, and the priority goals are, in the consensus phase, it's what is a priority for this student, because we know we have paperwork and all kinds. What's the priority? And that's really the last step. And I feel like they really align with the I call it the flow chart, but working through this reflective decision-making process. So I think that's all I had to say about that. If there's questions about this IEP process, oh yes, thank you, Lucie.
Yes.
Yes, I'm not reading my notes because I want to go fast, but that's
Whenever possible,
absolutely.
involve student in all phases of the IEP process. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I just wanted to say, Lucie, you're reminding me that this is J'ai mon plan, and it's from Université Laval. We've been doing a lot of work at the provincial level on it. It's really focused on self-determined IEPs, and that's really the student that is in charge of their choices. The opposite of a self-determined student would be that the student feels everything's imposed on them. They have no control. So that might help to situate. And so what I wanted to say is, if you want to know more about this, Nancy Gaudreau will be at LCEQ and talking up this whole IEP process called J'ai mon plan. And I noticed the link, a question was in the chat. The reference is in the references section under Université Laval.
Yeah,
so
it's
that
great.
was just a hover, and how where does that IEP fit in here?
It's here, the link at the end. So you'll get it in the handout. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sorry for that tangent, but I thought it was important to see how throughout the process, we're actually building a very similar process with regards to the IEP and our behavior intervention, and how they eventually come together. So I hope I made that explicit for you.
It's great, Heather. Thank you so much. There's one last question, and then I'm just gonna move quickly to show just where to situate ourselves. One of the main questions that I often get is, so when do I know that a student requires services beyond what a regular classroom can provide? And it's a tough question, because depending on which school you're at, which school board your school is part of, not all regions have access to the same resources. Some of your school boards have regional programs, have these more specialized supports, have access to outside services like child psychiatry and so forth, day programs, and so forth, that other places just don't have access to. And so, this is where I would say the schools that don't have all these extra additional resources, this is where trying to think outside the box at tier 3, and as much as we can, to have these pockets of time and space for the student outside the classroom, in the school, in the building, where they can have a more of an alternative setting, and that there's academics that still take place there. They're not just going there to have fun and to hang out. Those alternative spaces are there for academics as well. And so I could have a whole other presentation on the pyramid of intervention. I don't have time right now to do it, but those that are interested, please take a look at the website, and there's a whole section dedicated to that. But it is possible in a region where there aren't outside supports, as many as we'd like to have, to be able to build in something in-house to be able to support these kids. And for those that do have those resources, make sure that you don't overly use them as well. How often I've seen schools that will throw too many kids at spaces like the Nurturing Support Center or the Emotions Room, and there's not enough tier 1 happening in the classroom. And so you want to make sure that, because I've seen it happen time and time again, where at the beginning of the school year, things are kind of okay, and there's some tier 1 or little tier 1, and all of a sudden, as the year progresses, we get more and more of these heavy cases. And I've seen it, that if you keep the tier 1 and that you invest in the tier 1, that you might actually see things regress and become at a more manageable space than to try to send these kids out to these more specialized when they may not even need to have these specialized spaces, and you don't know until you've tried it. And again, I do understand you're in an educational setting, and sometimes it's not possible to maintain a student in school, and that we need to look at what's beyond, and then it's, you know, it's up to your board and region to see what's possible. I'm going to stop this presentation because I just want to show quickly. I just want to do a new share of my desktop because I just want to show you guys quickly the website. So if you go onto the CEBM main website, there's a button here called the Resource Center. If you click onto the Resource Center, this will bring you to a second website, which is the CEBM Resource Center. So under theoretical framework, you will find the pyramid of intervention. So if you click there, you will find the general pyramid of intervention for elementary, for high school, and K4, K5 is it will be available soon. And I've got a presentation that I had done on it way back when. And I've got also for transitions, for those that are looking for during recess and lunch, you've got that too. Here is the document, the supporting document that goes with the pyramid of intervention. But this is, again, not to be done alone by the teacher. It's done with a team, with the support of a consultant and or professional. If you want to know about the resources that we talked about, underneath practices, you've got tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So if I just go to tier, and you also have during the transition. So if I go to tier 1, you've got the section for tier 1 in English and in French. And then you've got all of the supporting documents and resources underneath here. So you've got additional video capsules, documents, resources, all of that. And then the planning documents are at the bottom there. So you've got for tier 1, you've got for tier 2, and for tier 3. I mentioned before that these are for elementary. So I am going to be working with a team for K4, K5, and for high school. So those, I mean, some of them can be applicable to high school, but not all of them, obviously. Somebody asked me for the pyramid of intervention, somebody asked me for the brain break for high school. Right now, because I haven't done the high school version on the resource center, on the main website, underneath practices, there is a section called K4, K5 and a section called secondary. If you click on secondary, you will find not only webinars for high school, but you will also find the pyramid. And here you will find a few resources and the brain break editorials right here. So here's the section for high school. And I'm going to work on revamping this page. I'm not there yet. And same thing for K4, K5. I've got a few editorials and a few resources, but honestly, there's so much more to come. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop recording. Stop recording.